The wind pushed hard against the glass that night, rattling the panes in their wooden frames. I was alone in the front office, the old wall clock ticking just past 2 in. The morning when I noticed the footprints. They came in from the back entrance, tracked across the tile, and stopped just short of the desk. But no one had come through the lobby. No one had spoken. Just wet, half-melted shapes pressed into the floor as though someone had been standing there in silence, watching me work. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever spent a night somewhere that didn't feel quite right. And if these stories keep you company, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. My name is Dana Ellis. I was 37 years old when this happened, and I worked the late desk at a mountain lodge in Colorado. It was a modest place, the kind of lodge people booked when the weather trapped them on the highway and they couldn't push further west. The owners lived down in Denver and only came by on weekends, so most nights it was just me and the maintenance man, Len Turner, keeping watch over the empty halls. Winters were always the hardest. The roads iced over by dusk, and guests would sometimes stagger in looking like ghosts out of a snowdrift, relieved to find any bed at all. This was back in early 2006, when storms seemed to roll through every other week, burying the mountain passes in white. That night, the lodge had gone quiet just before the wind picked up. We'd had a full house earlier, a ski group from New Mexico, but they'd checked out by sundown to beat the storm. By midnight, only 2 cars sat in the lot, Len's pickup and mine. I remember thinking how still it felt, like the building itself had braced for the weight of snow pressing down on the roof. At 12:47 a.m., the bell above the lobby door chimed. A man stepped in from the blizzard, brushing frost from his shoulders. He didn't say a word, not even hello, just slid a folded bill across the counter with one gloved hand. His face was pale from the cold. Lined maybe in his early 50s. He wore a dark coat with the collar pulled high, and he kept his eyes down as I checked the register. I asked for a name for the ledger, but he only shook his head once. The silence was heavy, almost deliberate, and when I offered the key to room 4, he took it without speaking. He carried no luggage, just a small leather satchel slung across his chest. I remember watching him cross the lobby toward the stairs. His boots left a damp trail, and for some reason the sound of each step felt too loud in the empty building. Len came in from the side hall just as the man disappeared upstairs. He gave me a look, one eyebrow raised. I told him about the cash payment and the lack of a name. Len shrugged, said folks passed through like that sometimes, but I could tell he was unsettled too. For the next hour, the snow only thickened. The wind moaned against the eaves, and the power flickered twice before holding steady. Around 200, I got up to make coffee and noticed the side entrance was unlatched. That door was rarely used, mostly for staff, and I could swear I had locked it earlier. Fresh snow blew in through the crack, already forming a thin drift across the mat. When I shut it tight again, I saw the prints leading down the hall toward the lobby. They matched the boots of the man in room 4. I told myself he must have gone out for air, though no sane person would have stepped into that storm without reason. Still, I checked the security log. No exterior doors had opened, not officially, not according to the sensors. That's when I felt the quiet shift, like the building had drawn in a breath. Len found me standing near the desk, staring at the damp marks on the floor. He asked if I'd heard the pipes knocking, said it had woken him down in the maintenance office. We listened together, but the lodge was silent. No pipes, no creaks, just the steady tick of the wall clock and the low hum of the furnace. Then the prince caught his eye. He knelt, touched the wet edge, and frowned. "These are fresh," he whispered. We went upstairs to room 4, the floorboards groaning under our weight. The key I'd given him was still in the door, hanging loose in the lock, but the room beyond was empty. Bed unslept, window sealed, no satchel in sight. Just the faint smell of cedar, like wood smoke carried in on a coat. Len checked the bathroom. Dry towels, clean sink. Nothing to suggest anyone had been inside. I stood in the doorway, feeling the hair lift on my arms. I knew what I'd seen in the lobby. I had handed him the key myself, yet the room showed no trace of him at all. We went back downstairs, uneasy. Len said he'd check the cameras, though they were old, grainy feeds that rarely caught much. I stayed at the desk, staring at the empty staircase, half expecting him to appear again. Minutes dragged into nearly an hour. At 3:12 a.m., the camera monitor crackled. Len called me over. On the black and white screen, the side hallway flickered into view. A tall figure moved across the frame. Coat collar pulled high, same satchel across the chest. He walked with careful, deliberate steps, but what made my stomach tighten was how he moved toward the lobby desk, right up to where I'd been sitting earlier. He stood there still as a shadow facing the empty chair. Then he turned and walked back toward the side door. The system timestamp confirmed it 2:07 a.m., the same time I'd been in the kitchen making coffee. The door had never registered opening, but there he was, on the tape. Len rewound it twice, both of us silent, watching that grainy outline move, as though he knew exactly where he was going. Then on the third replay, Len leaned closer. "Look at his arm," he muttered. The image was blurred but clear enough to see the wristband beneath the coat sleeve. Not a watch, not a bracelet. It looked like one of those fabric bands they give you at county fairs. Neither of us said anything more. We just let the tape play, the screen washing back into static. The rest of the night passed without incident. No more prints, no more strange footsteps. By sunrise, the storm had quieted, leaving the lot buried in white. Only 2 sets of tire tracks cut through the drifts, mine and Len's. Room 4 remained untouched, its bedspread smooth as I had left it. But sometimes when the wind rattles the windows just before dawn, I still remember the damp prints on the lobby tile, stopping just short of my chair, as if someone had been standing there for longer than I realized. I don't usually talk about this. It's the kind of memory that changes how people look at you, like you should have seen it coming sooner. I thought I was careful, and maybe I was, but not careful enough. When I closed on the house, it felt like a small victory after too many cramped years downtown. It was a one-story place with a patchy lawn and a fence that matched every other fence on the street. The first week was quiet in a way that made me feel lighter, the kind of quiet where you finally hear your own breath when you shut the refrigerator door at night. I worked from the kitchen table, answered emails, and set a radio low enough to be more temperature than sound. Nothing about those days suggested anything but normal, and I wish I could go back and stand there a little longer before things tilted. It was a Saturday afternoon when I heard my full name called from the driveway first and last with the rhythm of attendance roll. I stepped out with a box in my hands and saw a man I knew but didn't fully recognize, smiling like we were about to share an old joke. "Evan Chambers," he said, already moving closer, a six-pack tucked under his arm. We'd had gym together years before, maybe a group project. Once, nothing more than that. Time had given him a buzz cut, a little softness at the jaw, and a wristband he wore like it had a story he wouldn't explain. He said he lived nearby, said he saw the moving truck, said it felt like fate. I nodded because what else do you do when a familiar face lands on your porch with a grin and cold beer? That first night we talked about nothing for an hour. He asked how freelance life treated me, and made observations about the neighborhood, the way the streetlights threw a circle of yellow that didn't quite reach the sidewalk. Just when I started to relax, two men I didn't know drifted in behind him like late additions to a plan. Evan introduced them as Mike and Ridge, and they took a long, slow look around my living room that felt more like measuring than curiosity. Mike asked if I had roommates in a way that sounded like he expected me to say yes. Ridge commented on how the back windows would make it easy to see the yard in a storm. I told myself they were awkward, maybe overly interested, and I let it go because it felt easier to be polite than to be rude in my own house. Evan stopped by again the next day, and then again the day after that. He never texted first. He just appeared at odd times like he was walking a route, and my front door was on it. Sometimes he brought different men with him, none of whom seemed invested in small talk. One afternoon, I caught a guy with a neck tattoo easing open the hallway closet while I was filling a glass at the sink. He laughed when I asked what he needed and said he was hunting for the bathroom, even though it was visible down the hall with the door open and the fan running. I smiled without meaning it and made a note in my head that sat there like a stone. After a week of drop-ins, I started letting calls go to voicemail when I saw Evan's car idle at the curb. I pretended not to be home, lights off, television dark, the kind of quiet where the ice maker sounds like tapping fingers. It didn't change much. He showed up one evening around 9 with a heavy-set man who never introduced himself. I cracked the door, kept the screen between us, and told Evan I was buried in deadlines and needed to keep nights open for a while. He looked past my shoulder into the dim living room as if he expected a party I hadn't invited him to. He laughed like he believed me and didn't at the same time. And then he stepped back with a shrug. "You might want to latch that side gate," he said easily, as if the thought had just occurred to him. Anyone could wander in. I pretended his comment belonged to the category of friendly advice, but the words sat wrong. I rarely used that gate and couldn't remember leaving it open. After they left, I walked the inside perimeter like a person rehearsing a new routine and locked every window I could reach. The alarm system that came with the house had a pleasant chime I found reassuring, so I armed it before bed and felt that small relief of a green light where a green light should be. In the morning, the panel blinked an error. I reset it and told myself I must have hit the wrong button. The next day, the screen was black. When I called the company, the technician on the phone asked me to check the main panel in the laundry room. The cover was slightly ajar, not enough to be obvious, just enough to show someone had been there who didn't care if I found out later. He told me the system had been disabled at the panel manual override and that he could send a tech in 3 days. I stood there with my thumb on the edge of the plastic cover, listening to the dryer tick as it cooled and thought about the side gate. The previous owner had left a small security camera pointed at the front door, and part of the hallway more like a convenience than protection. I had synced it to my phone out of habit the day I moved in, and then never opened the app again. That afternoon, I sat on the couch and scrolled back through the last 2 nights of footage, expecting nothing, hoping for nothing. The timestamp rolled by in silent increments until 3:12 a.m., when the side door I never used slid open without a sound. On the screen, a figure in a hooded jacket moved through my living room with a care that felt practiced. He never looked up, never glanced toward the camera, just walked with intent straight past the couch and into the laundry room where the panel sat. He didn't fumble. He didn't hesitate. He reached under the cover and waited until the status light blinked out. Then he stood still for a moment, like he was listening for something I couldn't hear. When he turned to go, the cuff of his jacket rode up just enough to show a fabric band on his wrist. The image was grainy, but the shape of that band was familiar in a way that made my mouth go dry. I replayed it again and again until repetition dulled the shock and left only the detail. The way he held his shoulders, the angle of his head, the easy route from door to panel like he'd walked it before. I sat there with the phone in my hand until the battery warning flashed, and then I put the footage on a thumb drive and drove to the station because it felt like the only thing that might tilt the world back where it belonged. The officer at the desk asked calm questions, the kind that keep a person talking without pushing them toward panic. I told him about the visits, the side gate, the men with Evan, and he wrote in small, neat letters that made me think he had good penmanship long before he wore a badge. He took the footage to a back room, and when he returned, he told me to stay somewhere else, for a few nights if I could. It wasn't drama in his voice, just the kind of caution that comes from seeing the same story too many times, with worse endings. I packed a bag and drove to my sister's place across town without telling anyone where I was going. I didn't text friends because I didn't know what to say that didn't sound like an accusation or an apology. My sister asked if I wanted tea and turned on a lamp with a soft shade that made her living room feel warmer than mine had felt in days. We watched the local news without listening to it and kept the conversation in the shallow end of the pool. The next day, I called a company that advertised full coverage packages, motion lights, cameras that see in the dark, sirens that cut through sleep. I scheduled the installation and gave them the gate as my first concern. While I waited for the appointment, I checked the app again out of habit and found nothing but empty rooms bathed in afternoon light and the pleasant movement of a curtain when the air conditioner kicked on. It felt ridiculous to jump at the sound of the ice maker when my phone confirmed no one had walked across my living room all day. 2 days later, I got a call from Detective Hall, who had followed up on the report. His voice was patient and worn at the edges by too many similar conversations. He said the man I knew from high school had a record that wasn't impressive enough to be dramatic, but was enough to matter: trespassing, petty theft, small-time charges that suggested a pattern. He told me 2 of the men who had been with him at my house matched arrests from 3 weeks earlier for a break-in a few blocks south of my place. In that case, the homeowner was gone for the weekend. The alarm cut at the panel, the house stripped down to electronics and jewelry. Same basic rhythm, he said, and I could hear the paper sliding on his desk as he read. Befriend, observe, disable, rob. I asked what to do next, like there was a right answer that would put the lid back on this. He told me to keep my plans to myself for a while, to let the installation happen, to stay with family if I could, and to call if I saw anyone watching the house. He didn't say it out loud, but I understood the subtext. This was likely over only if they decided it was over. Evan didn't come back. He didn't text or knock or drive by slow with the radio off, at least not when I was there to notice. It would be easy to say the new cameras scared him off, or the report, or the fact that his name was now attached to my address in a system I couldn't see. Maybe someone told him the police had questions, and he chose to turn his route another direction. It doesn't matter why. The absence was loud enough to make its own kind of noise. I tried to settle back into the house after the install. The motion lights flared whenever a neighborhood cat slipped through the fence, and each time my heart stepped hard enough in my chest to remind me I was still a person in a body. I rearranged furniture like different angles would change the past, and parked my car with the driver's seat far back so it looked empty from the street. Sleep returned in short stretches that felt like borrowed time. The house went on being a house. The water heater coughed the same way in the morning. The mail slot clicked around noon. The radio in the kitchen gave me weather and traffic and half an hour of songs before an ad break. Nothing was broken except the part of me that would never look at a quiet room the same way again. In May, I called a realtor because I wanted my long days to end somewhere my hands hadn't shaken while I held a phone in the dark. When the sign went up in the yard, I stood at the front window and watched a couple slow to look at the listing sheet and point at the roof line. They smiled like people do when they can see themselves in a place, and I didn't feel any sense of loss. Selling wasn't defeat. It was an acknowledgement that some spaces absorb a story you don't want to keep telling yourself every time the light hits the floor in a familiar way. On the last night before the closing, I walked the perimeter one more time, not because I expected anyone to be there, but because repetition can sometimes keep fear from growing larger than it has to be. I latched the side gate and pressed the board that stuck until it settled with the small sound I had come to know. I locked the back door and the front, and then I checked both again without thinking. Before I turned in, I stood by the laundry room and looked at the panel with its neat green light and the plastic cover snapped tight. The room smelled like detergent and warm air, unremarkable and clean. I didn't replay the footage again after that. I didn't need to see the hooded figure cross my living room, calm and sure, to remember that the worst part wasn't the break-in that didn't happen. It was the performance that led up to it, the friendly wave in the driveway, the six-pack, the casual laugh at the door, and a wristband slipping from a sleeve as someone moved exactly where I would never expect a friend to go. When people ask why I sold, I say I wanted a shorter commute and a different neighborhood, and both statements are true enough for polite conversation. The rest lives in the way I touch the deadbolt now 3 times before bed, waiting for the small, certain click that tells me I have done everything I can for the night. Sometimes when the house is quiet and the refrigerator hum settles into the background, I still hear the suggestion he made through the screen like it was nothing. You might want to latch that side gate. Anyone could wander in. I keep that line the way you keep a label on a box in the garage so you don't have to open it to remember what's inside. I grew up thinking camping was simple. You packed light, followed a trail, built a fire, and hiked back out when you were ready. But the last trip I ever took with friends cured me of that idea forever. Marcus had just landed a promotion at his firm, and he suggested a celebratory weekend in Oregon's Willamette National Forest. 7 of us made the trip: me, Marcus, Brian, Sam, Josh, Tyler, and Nate. We had known each other since college, though years and distance had thinned our connection. The plan was ordinary enough: hike in on Friday, camp by the lake, spend 2 nights around the fire, and head back out on Sunday. We had done similar trips before, but the atmosphere felt strange from the start. There were tensions I couldn't place, conversations that dropped off too quickly, and small irritations that clung like burrs even before we left the parking lot. Friday evening started better than I expected. We made it to the lake by dusk, set up camp, and passed a bottle around until the stars looked powdered across the black sky. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke, and for a few hours it almost felt like old times. Marcus gave a short toast about keeping traditions alive, and we all laughed and clapped his shoulder. The night ended with most of us stumbling into tents, but I noticed Nate walking the tree line long after the fire burned low. He paced in slow loops with his hands buried in his hoodie pocket, stopping every so often to look out into the dark. When I asked if he was good, he gave a small smile and said he was just soaking it all in. The next morning, Nate suggested we do a loop hike before heading back to the lake by evening. He had brought rolls of orange ribbon to mark the trail since the path wasn't maintained, and no one questioned him. We set off single file, breathing clouds of cool air, listening to the forest swallow our voices. But after a few hours, the hike began to feel wrong. Brian swore we passed the same rock formation twice. Sam pointed out one of Nate's markers, tied in 2 directions at once, as if guiding us down different paths. We laughed it off at first, but the jokes thinned quickly. By mid-afternoon, no one was laughing. The forest grew denser the further we went. The pines crowded close, the ground thick with needles, the light dim even though the sun was high. The air was still in a way that made you aware of your own footsteps, your own breathing. By late afternoon, Josh snapped at Nate for leading us in circles. Nate just shrugged and said he was following the trail he had marked. But the markers didn't make sense anymore. They pointed in directions that led back to the same place, ribbons tied to trees we swore we had already seen. The woods had a way of repeating themselves, like someone had copied and pasted the same stretch of forest again and again. As the sky dimmed, the mood shifted from irritation to something heavier. We started checking our gear, and that's when we realized items were missing. Tyler's spare flashlight and food pack were gone from his bag. Brian's compass and whistle had disappeared too. At first, we thought they must have dropped them somewhere along the trail, but the weight of realization settled in slowly. Someone had taken them. Someone among us had been pulling things from packs when we weren't looking. I caught Marcus's face in the fading light, pale and blank, as though he was trying to reboot his thoughts. We came across a small clearing with an old fire pit, stones, blackened by ash. The remains of half-burnt sticks poked out of the dirt. Around it were footprints that weren't ours, some pressed fresh into the soil. A granola wrapper that belonged to our group was half buried at the edge of the circle. None of us remembered being there before. It felt like someone had set a trail for us to follow, and I hated how effective it was. We decided to camp in that clearing, not because it felt safe, but because it was open enough to see if anyone approached. I stayed up with Brendan, taking turns watching the tree line. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps crunching leaves just beyond the circle of light. Not animal movement, deliberate steps. I shone my flashlight toward the trees, but the beam scattered into mist and branches. That's when I saw it. A new orange ribbon tied high on a trunk just outside our camp, a ribbon that hadn't been there when we settled in. We left at first light, following a stream downhill in the hope it would lead to the road. No one spoke. The only sound was rushing water and the hurried rhythm of our boots. After an hour, Haley, who had been holding up better than most, cried out. Her missing sleeping bag lay wedged between 2 rocks, soaked as if someone had tried to weigh it down and push it downstream. My stomach clenched with a fear I couldn't name. Someone had been close to us all night, moving through our camp while we slept, leaving markers like breadcrumbs only we were meant to see. When we finally stumbled back to the lake, our tents were still standing, but ripped wide open down the sides. Brendan's backpack was gone, along with the spare car key we had stashed inside. Tyler shouted Nate's name, but he was already gone. No note, no trace. We searched the perimeter, the parking lot, even retraced part of the trail, but Nate had vanished as if the forest had swallowed him. We made it out only because Haley had hidden a second car key inside the sole of her boot. It was a detail she hadn't shared with anyone. I still wonder if that small act of paranoia saved us all. We piled into the car without speaking, just letting the sound of the tires on gravel carry us away from that place. 2 days later, Nate sent a single text to the group chat. Glad you made it out okay. No apology, no explanation. Then he left the chat. I haven't heard from him since. None of us have. I don't know what he was trying to prove or what snapped inside him that weekend. Maybe he wanted to scare us, or maybe he wanted us to understand some twisted lesson about trust and control. What keeps me awake sometimes is that he had every chance to hurt us directly, but he didn't. Instead, he moved quietly through our camp while we slept, watching us flinch at every missing item, every misdirected ribbon, every deliberate step in the dark. I sold my camping gear within the month. I haven't stepped into a forest since. Still, there are nights I wake from dreams where I'm back in that clearing, the mist curling around the fire pit, and an orange ribbon hangs just above my head. I don't usually talk about this, not because I'm embarrassed, but because it edges the conversation into a place where people tilt their heads and search my face for clues I can't give them. The first full-time job I ever had was in a glass building downtown, the kind that reflected the sky in a way that made afternoon clouds look like they were drifting through offices. I moved to Charlotte that summer with a second-hand couch, mismatched dishes, and the conviction that being busy would fix whatever loneliness lived in me. Days were emails and onboarding videos, coffee in a paper cup, a badge that never scanned on the first try, and the slow hope that I would eventually feel like I belonged. I wanted very simple things back then, like finding a lunch table where I didn't have to pretend to text while I waited. Her name was Kara. She stopped beside my desk on a Tuesday and asked about the little enamel pin on my satchel, a band logo most people my age had forgotten. She said she loved their early albums, and it felt like someone had reached over and turned up the volume on my day. Within a week, we were eating together, comparing notes on the worst office coffee, and sending each other links to thrift stores we couldn't afford. She had an easy way of watching you that felt like attention, and I mistook it for kindness because it was easier than thinking too hard about it. Kara remembered small details like they were passwords to something important. She noticed I took my coffee black and brought me the first cup one morning, before I had even put my bag down. She saw when I swapped the charm on my keychain and asked about it before noon. She complimented a pair of shoes, then showed up 2 days later wearing a pair cut from the same pattern, different color. It seemed like flattery, the kind you accept, because the alternative is telling someone you're uncomfortable with their admiration. She joked that we were becoming twins, and the joke worked because it was close enough to the truth to be funny. The first real shift happened so gently that I didn't mark it as a shift. She followed my roommate Jess on social media after seeing her tagged in a photo, and then she appeared at a birthday gathering. I had mentioned offhand sliding into my kitchen with a bag of limes and the confidence of a cousin who lives around the corner. She fit so smoothly that people assumed we had known each other for years. Later that week, I realized she had quoted back a private story I had only told Jess during a late apartment night with the sink running and the window open. I told myself I must have mentioned it at lunch without realizing. I started to feel crowded without understanding why. That feeling sharpened into clarity on a Thursday after a day of meetings that left a small bell ringing behind my eyes. I left early and took the back stairs because the elevator was slow, and when I opened my apartment door, the living room was in twilight. The only glow came from my desk. Kara stood there leaning over my laptop, a small USB drive plugged into the side. She didn't startle when I stepped in. She turned like she had been expecting a different version of me to arrive later. For a second, we didn't speak. She was calm in a way that made my heartbeat feel loud. She said it wasn't what it looked like, but didn't step away from the desk. She reached into the pocket of a coat that wasn't hers, and that was the detail that tipped everything inside me. It was my coat, a thrifted navy thing I wore on cool evenings, and seeing her hand disappear into it made something inside me go cold. I reached for my phone, and she moved. The space between us closed quickly. She shoved my shoulder hard enough to send my hip into the doorframe. Then she was gone, down the stairs, before I managed to breathe again. The police came and did the things they could do. They asked for a list of what was missing, then asked if I had noticed anything strange before today. I told them about the party and the jokes about being twins, and the USB blinking blue in my laptop, while the room smelled like the apartment heater. Sergeant Alvarez took notes with careful block letters and told me to freeze cards and change passwords. He said identity issues can tangle quickly if you're not early to them, and I nodded while my mind felt like a radio tuned between stations. I wanted to believe the damage had been limited to a strange moment in a dim room. It took about a week to learn I was wrong. Charges hit accounts I didn't recognize. A car loan appeared tied to an address in another state. A notification arrived for an application I had never submitted, and then another, each one insisting on a confirmation I didn't give. I had copies of my passport scanned from travel paperwork. I had pay statements saved because HR said to keep them. I had left my laptop set to remember more than it should because convenience, like kindness, is easy to mistake for safety. At work, I tried to explain without sounding like I was smearing a coworker who had charmed people faster than I ever would. HR called in Mr. Walters and asked for details. He pulled Kara's file and frowned over the emergency contact, which turned out to be someone who didn't answer and likely didn't exist. Her phone number went to a message that never beeped for recording. People looked at me with a careful distance, the way you look at someone standing on a thin layer of ice. A few suggested that maybe I had been careless with my information, which is a tidy explanation when the alternative is facing how easily trust can be engineered. By the time the bank calls stabilized into a process, the police had traced a piece of this to an Airbnb in Florida rented under my name. Detectives found a laptop and 3 prepaid cards, but no clear image of the person who had used them. Cameras on the street pointed in every direction except the doorway that mattered, and the prints lifted off the device refused to match anyone in a system. Whoever Kara had been on paper dissolved, and I learned how quickly you can vanish if you build your life from details other people don't check. I moved apartments that month because sleeping in the same room where she had stood felt like a dare. I wasn't interested in accepting. I locked the bedroom door for the first time in my life and found out I didn't sleep better. But I did sleep. Jess kept a bat near the couch for a while, as a joke that wasn't one. And we tested our windows like people preparing for wind instead of visitors. I bought a small metal box for documents and added a key to my ring that felt heavier than it should. The worst part wasn't the money, though. Losing it pressed a dent into every decision for a year. The worst part was the eraser. I would find little things gone and realize she had taken the shape of my preferences and cut around it. My playlists matched playlists I didn't recognize under other account names. Phrases I grew up saying appeared in emails from addresses created last month, spelled like I spelled them with the same odd punctuation. She had borrowed my lip balm once, and then she bought the same brand in bulk. She moved like a person rehearsing the part of me that faced outward, and that is hard to explain to anyone who hasn't watched it happen. I kept records in a binder because the act of hole-punching paper felt stronger than another password on another portal. I filed police reports and paused credit and staged small victories like getting a fraudulent notice removed after only 3 calls instead of 6. Work became a place where I breathed shallowly, and I learned to answer questions in a calm tone that made people nod. My manager said we could keep my role while I sorted things out, and I nodded back while charting a path that didn't require anyone's patience. Months later, an unknown number texted a sentence that didn't include her name, like a person leaning into a doorway rather than knocking. It said, "Can you believe it's been a year?" Miss your laugh. I blocked it before my eyes finished reading, and then I deleted it, and then I stood in the kitchen with my back against the counter until my knees stopped feeling strange. Nothing else followed. Sometimes that is worse than something. I did get my life back in pieces. A patient banker helped unwind the car loan stitched to my name. An attorney wrote letters that carried more weight than mine. My credit became a slow repair instead of an open wound, and I got another job in another city that didn't know my story. People like ending with that part because it sounds like you leave the rest behind. You don't. You carry it differently, that's all. I don't use the same email for anything important now. I don't keep scans where I don't need them, and I don't save passwords because I trust my memory more than convenience. Those are good habits, but they aren't a cure. A cure would be walking into a room and not seeing the shape of someone who once stood there wearing your coat with their hand in the pocket like it belonged to them, and there isn't a habit for that. Sometimes I see a woman from behind who has my walk because she has watched someone who walks like me, and the feeling that climbs my spine is sharper than surprise. Sometimes I open a new account and pause before typing my own name because it looks less solid now than it did before. People say identity theft like it is a technical phrase that belongs to screens and forms. It isn't. It is someone smiling at you while measuring the edges of your life and deciding which ones to cut. I keep a small box in the back of a closet with copies of the letters that got the worst of it fixed. I don't look at them often. I keep them the way you keep proof that a story happened, so you don't waste energy convincing yourself you imagined it. Every so often, I think about how Kara slid into my world with a question about a pin, and how that felt like relief at the time. Maybe that is the part that bothers me most, that the first step looked exactly like kindness. There isn't a dramatic ending. There is no last confrontation on a sidewalk or a final message that explains why. The last image I have is the glow of my laptop in a dim room and her calm face turning toward me. Not surprised, not afraid, just sure that she belonged there, because she had practiced it enough times to believe it. When the house gets quiet and the heater clicks on at night, that light comes back, and I see the outline of her hand on my keyboard, like a shadow glass can hold. I fall asleep eventually, but I always check the door first, and I always turn the lock twice, not because I think it will stop someone determined, but because the sound reminds me I still get to be the one who decides who steps inside. I grew up around trucks, the kind that rattled old county roads and leaned heavy when you pressed the brakes too hard. My father used to say the cab becomes your second skin, and I didn't understand that until I started hauling full-time in my 30s. By the time I turned 41, I had the habit of measuring weeks, not by dates, but by miles, and I often found myself somewhere between one edge of Texas and another, before realizing how much time had passed. The night I'm about to describe still comes back to me, with the taste of burnt coffee and the smell of diesel in cold air. I had been running a route that kept me too long behind schedule, and by the time I reached the outskirts of Amarillo, the clock on my dash read past 2 in the morning. I remember the sky being cloudless black in a way that pressed down the kind of night where the world seems to shrink into a strip of asphalt under your headlights. I pulled into a truck stop that looked more tired than alive, the neon buzzing so faintly I half expected it to blink out as I parked. The diner attached to it had 6 booths and a counter lined with cracked stools, the sort of place where you could tell everything had been wiped down often, but nothing ever looked clean. The waitress introduced herself as Donna slid a mug of coffee in front of me and asked if I wanted eggs. Her eyes stayed on me longer than most people's do, as though she was listening for something behind my answer. While I sat there, another driver came in, Tom Avery, a man I'd seen around depots a few times, but never spoken to much. He looked older than I remembered his face, pale under the fluorescent lights. He slid into the booth across from me without asking, like we had agreed to meet. He didn't order, didn't even touch the menu. He just leaned forward and said, You've seen it too, haven't you? I thought maybe he meant the storm I had been tracking in my mirrors earlier, or the strange line of cars I had noticed idling without headlights miles back. But before I could ask, he added, "The man on the shoulder." His voice was low, like saying it too loud might invite something in. I told him I hadn't seen anyone, and he nodded as though I was lying to myself. He said there was a stretch of road west of town where drivers kept reporting a figure walking against the traffic, always in the same clothes, always at the same spot, no matter what time of night you passed. Some said they slowed down to offer help, only for the figure to vanish in the sweep of their brake lights. Others swore he appeared closer each time, as if pacing them long enough to study their faces. I wanted to laugh it off. Truckers share more stories than loads, and most of them are stitched together from boredom and caffeine. But something about Tom's expression, drawn tight eyes darting to the windows, made me hold the coffee mug tighter than I should. He told me the last driver who stopped to help never made it home. His rig was found idling on the shoulder door ajar, hazard lights clicking into an empty night. No sign of him anywhere. Donna came over with a plate of eggs I hadn't ordered, set them down in front of me, and told Tom it was late enough to let a man eat in peace. I remember the way her hand lingered on my shoulder when she refilled my cup, like she wanted to anchor me there a little longer. Tom stood abruptly, muttered something about making miles, and left without saying goodbye. I sat in that booth until nearly 3, watching the door, as though expecting him to walk back in. When I finally stepped outside, the air had turned colder sharp against my throat. My rig sat under the buzzing light, and across the lot, Tom's truck was still there, engine idling, but he was nowhere in sight. I walked past it, glanced through the window, and saw the cab empty. His coffee thermos sat upright in the cup holder, steam curling faintly, as though he had just set it down. I told myself he had gone inside to pay, maybe use the restroom, and I climbed into my own truck. But when I checked the mirrors before pulling out, I noticed something that didn't make sense. The passenger door of his rig was wide open, swinging slightly in the wind, and no one was around to close it. I drove west, trying to convince myself not to look at the shoulder, not to slow down if I saw anything that resembled a person. The road stretched empty, the white lines flickering under the beams, and then, just as Tom had said, I saw him. A man in dark clothes walking against the traffic, head tilted down, arms stiff at his sides. He didn't raise a hand, didn't signal distress. He just moved steadily, each step measured as though he had been walking that same patch forever. I tightened my grip on the wheel and kept going, but something in me forced a glance into the side mirror. For less than a heartbeat, the reflection showed him closer than he should have been, like he had covered 50 yards in the blink of an eye. When I looked back through the windshield, the shoulder was empty. The rest of that drive blurred into a kind of silence I've only ever felt in hospitals, the kind where every sound is swallowed before it reaches your ears. I didn't stop until I crossed into New Mexico, where the sun finally started to lift the weight of the night. 2 days later, I heard through another driver that Tom's rig was still at the Amarillo stop, towed only after sitting abandoned for more than a day. No one had seen him since. The logbooks said he never finished his route. Officer Caldwell from Highway Patrol asked me if I'd spoken to him that night, and I admitted I had, though I left out the part about the figure. He shook his head and said, "Drivers go missing sometimes, but not like this, never leaving a truck idling, never vanishing in the middle of their shift. I've passed that stretch of highway since, though I make a point not to look too closely at the shoulder. Once, just before dawn, I thought I caught the shape of someone standing in the fog, but the moment I blinked, it was gone. Sometimes, when the road is quiet and the mirrors show more dark than light, I half expect to see a figure pacing me, waiting for me to look too long. Truckers talk, and the story of the man on the shoulder still comes up, though no one mentions Tom by name anymore. I do. I remember the way he slid into that booth with urgency in his eyes, and I remember the open passenger door swaying in the wind. I keep telling myself I'll pull into another diner someday and find him there sipping coffee like nothing happened. But deep down I know the road keeps some people the way water keeps stones, hidden under the surface, where you can't quite see, but always know. That's why, even now, I never stop on that stretch west of Amarillo, no matter how tired I am, or how badly I need to rest. I drive straight through, hands tight on the wheel, hoping the man on the shoulder doesn't turn his head as I pass. I don't usually bring this night up, mostly because people look at me like I'm exaggerating, or worse, like I imagined the whole thing. But I remember it so clearly, every sound and shadow, as if it has been burned into the back of my mind. I was 27, finishing graduate school in Phoenix, and Eric had agreed to drive with me up to Colorado to spend Christmas with my family. We left later than we should have, and by the time we crossed into northern Arizona, the clock on the dash was glowing past midnight. The highway was quieter than I expected for the holiday season, the kind of empty that makes you feel like you're the last people awake in the world. The trees pressed close along the shoulders, black shapes against the faint orange light of the sky. By the time we pulled off at a rest stop near Flagstaff, the car was running low on gas, and my legs ached from sitting so long. The building itself was a square of cinder block with 2 restrooms, a vending machine tucked under a buzzing light, and a row of picnic tables half buried in frost. Eric went inside to use the bathroom while I waited near the car, the air colder than I had dressed for. That's when I noticed him. A man was sitting at one of the picnic tables, not moving, not even shifting his weight against the chill. He was dressed too lightly for the night, a button-down shirt without a jacket, and his hands rested flat on the wood as if he had been waiting a long time. At first, I thought he was asleep, with his eyes open, but when the light flickered overhead, he turned his head slightly toward me. His face looked pale in the fluorescent glow, not sick exactly, just drained of color, like paper left in the sun. I gave a small, polite nod the way you do with strangers, but he didn't respond. He just kept his eyes on me steady and fixed, and after a few seconds I turned away to dig my phone out of my purse. When Eric came back, I told him there was a man sitting out there, but when he looked, the table was empty. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I must have imagined him in the bad lighting, but I knew I hadn't. His outline, his stillness, the way the air seemed heavier while he watched me. It was all too sharp to be mistaken. We got back in the car and drove another hour before pulling into a small gas station that was still open. While Eric filled the tank, I went inside for coffee. The clerk behind the counter was an older man with a lined face, and when I mentioned we had stopped at the rest area near Flagstaff, he frowned immediately. He asked if we had seen anyone unusual there. I told him about the man at the picnic table, how he didn't seem dressed for the cold. The clerk shook his head slowly and said, "People keep seeing him. No one should be out there that time of night. His tone unsettled me, more than his words. It wasn't disbelief, it was resignation, like he already knew what I was going to say. We made it to my parents' place the next day, but that night lingered in the back of my mind. Weeks later, Eric sent me an article he had found online about disappearances near that rest stop. Travelers who pulled over after midnight sometimes never got back on the road. Cars were found abandoned with luggage still inside doors unlocked, gas tanks full. No signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away. Months after I was back in Phoenix, when I got a call from Officer Ruiz, a state trooper, who had tracked my name through the gas station clerk. He asked me to describe the man I had seen, and when I did, he went quiet. Finally, he said, "You're the third person this year who's given that same description." He wouldn't say more, only that if I drove that route again, I should keep going and never stop alone at night. Even now, years later, I sometimes dream of that man. He sits at the picnic table, his hands flat, his eyes locked on me, as if I've interrupted him in the middle of something I'll never understand. I wake with the sense that he's still waiting somewhere, still sitting under that weak fluorescent light, watching whoever pulls off the highway. Whenever I drive past that stretch, I keep my eyes forward, never turning my head. I tell myself the lot will be empty, but I always feel him there in the corner of my vision, waiting for someone to sit down across from him. I've wondered whether he chooses people, or whether he just waits for anyone foolish enough to notice. That's why, when the highway is quiet and the gas gauge dips low, I'd rather risk the empty miles than pull off into that rest stop, because I know he'll still be there, and I don't think he ever leaves. The last real job I ever had was working graveyard shift as a warehouse manager outside Allentown. It wasn't glamorous work, but it kept the bills paid and the hours suited me. The quiet nights gave me time to think, and I liked the order of it all, the sound of pallets shifting, the steady hum of the forklifts, and the occasional radio chatter from the overnight crew. By then, I had been at the job long enough that the place felt almost like a second home. That was before Wesley started. He was a new hire, early 20s, wiry and restless in a way that made me think of a stray dog still testing its leash. On paper, he looked fine, passed his checks, showed up on time, said the right things, but something about him didn't sit right with me. He had this habit of watching people a beat too long after a conversation ended, holding his smile until it felt wrong. Most of the guys laughed it off, calling him awkward, but I kept a closer eye. Night shifts bring out odd behaviors, but Wesley's felt practiced, like he was trying on expressions the way other people tried on jackets. One night, close to 2 in the morning, I was walking the floor when I saw him standing perfectly still at the end of an aisle. No clipboard, no palette, jack, nothing in his hands, just standing there with his head tilted, staring down toward the loading dock as if he were waiting for something I couldn't see. When he noticed me, he smiled too quickly, like a light switch flipping, and asked if I needed help with anything. The hairs rose on my arms because I hadn't said a word to him yet. Over the next few weeks, I caught him in stranger moments. He'd whisper to himself while stacking boxes, not words I could make out, but steady patterns of sound, almost like reciting lines. He followed other workers with his eyes, but if they looked back, he'd snap into action, grabbing the nearest item to look busy. The crew started avoiding him, ducking into other aisles or asking for different assignments. They joked about him in the break room. but I could tell they were unsettled in the same way I was. The night it all came to a head, I was in the office reviewing logs when the security camera flickered. The dock feed showed Wesley crouched near one of the delivery trucks, his face just outside the spill of the overhead light. He was scratching something into the metal door with a piece of wire moving slow and deliberate. I switched angles to get a better view, but by the time the camera adjusted, he was gone. I walked out to check, and sure enough, there were faint lines carved into the truck's paint loops and sharp angles like letters from no alphabet I knew. I told him to meet me in the office, and he came in grinning, like he already knew what I'd seen. When I asked him about the markings, he shrugged and said, "Just passing the time." His tone was flat, but his eyes stayed locked on mine too steady, as if he was waiting for me to flinch. I told him to take the rest of the night off and not come back until I cleared things with management. He stood up slowly, still smiling, and said, "You don't know who I am yet. I didn't call management first, I called the police. Officer Brewster showed up a man I'd met before on a few minor call-outs. He searched the warehouse and found Wesley sitting on a pallet in the dark, hands folded like he was posing for a picture. They brought him out calmly, no fight, no fuss. While they cuffed him, he turned his head toward me and said, 'I'll see you again, Mark. You'll know me then.' Hearing my name spoken like that, so casual, made me shiver in a way no threat ever had. The police ran his ID later and told me nothing was on file. No priors, no incidents, barely even a record of employment history. Brewster said men like that didn't stay out of the system long, and he'd probably surface somewhere else under a different name. They let him go with a trespass warning because technically he hadn't committed more than damage to the truck, and the company didn't want the hassle of pressing charges. For weeks after, I kept expecting him to walk back in through the warehouse doors, smiling like nothing had happened. Some nights I thought I heard his whispering again in the aisles, low and steady, like he had never left. I checked the cameras more often, scanning for that tilt of the head or the long pauses where he would simply watch. Nothing ever turned up. I eventually left that job, partly because of long hours, partly because I didn't like what the nights were doing to my nerves. Still, I can't shake the memory of that look he gave me, the certainty in his voice when he said I didn't know him yet. It wasn't bluster, not the way most people bluff to sound intimidating. It was calmer than that, like a promise. Every time I pass a warehouse district now, I find myself glancing at the loading bays, half expecting to see a thin figure crouched near a truck, scratching those looping symbols into the metal. And even though I've never seen Wesley again, I know he's out there somewhere, still practicing faces, still waiting for someone to finally recognize him. I spent a lot of nights on the road back then, pulling off highways into small towns I'd never heard of, staying at motels that looked tired even in daylight. There was one stop in Kansas I've never been able to forget. The place was older, a low row of single-story rooms with doors that opened straight to the parking lot, their paint faded by years of weather. It was late spring, warm but windy, the kind of evening where dust lifted in little spirals along the pavement. I checked in around 9, and the desk clerk, a gray-haired woman with a voice that carried the rasp of long cigarettes, slid the key across the counter like she had done it 10,000 times before. She warned me not to mind the noise in the far corner, saying one of the units was under repair. The room itself was plain, the carpet a shade of brown that couldn't quite hide its age, the bedspread patterned with shapes that looked more accidental than designed. The air smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals, sharp and almost medicinal. I set my suitcase down, switched on the television for background sound, and stretched out on the bed. For a while, it felt like any other night, channels, flipping headlights flashing past the curtains, the hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. Around midnight, the steady rhythm broke. From the adjoining room came the distinct creak of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing back and forth. I assumed someone had checked in late, but then I remembered the desk clerk's comment about that section being closed. The steps continued for several minutes, pausing near the shared wall, as if someone stood there listening. I muted the television and sat up, every nerve alert, straining to catch even the smallest sound. What unsettled me most was not the noise itself, but the gaps between it. Long stretches of silence, followed by the sudden scrape of a chair, or the thump of something heavy against the wall, as though objects were being moved carefully, but without purpose. At one point, I heard a faint knock, not on my door, but on the wall behind the headboard, like someone testing for hollow spots. I leaned close, held my breath, and whispered a soft hello, though I couldn't have said why. The response was a single tap, deliberate and measured, that traveled straight through the plaster into my bones. Sleep was impossible after that. I kept the lights on, flipping restlessly, checking the parking lot through the curtain's narrow slit. No cars were parked in front of the adjoining unit. Around 2, I decided to walk to the front office, if only to clear my head. The lot was still, except for the wind pushing empty soda cups against the curb. When I told the clerk about the noise, she frowned and shook her head. The adjoining room had been sealed for weeks, she said, stripped bare for renovations. No bed, no chair, nothing left inside at all. She offered to move me to another unit, but pride or fatigue made me decline. I told her I'd manage. Back in my room, the silence was heavier, oppressive, as though the space itself expected me to listen. Hours passed with only the occasional groan of the air conditioner. Then, sometime before dawn, I heard it again, 3 knocks perfectly spaced, right where my head met the wall. This time, I didn't answer. I sat in the chair until sunrise, suitcase packed, waiting for the first light to touch the curtains. When I checked out, the clerk looked at me like she already knew what kind of night I'd had. She didn't ask questions, and I didn't give her any details. I drove away with the radio low, watching the empty road stretch ahead, but the memory clung to me. Even now, I can hear those slow, deliberate taps, like someone signaling through a wall that should have separated nothing from nothing. I think about that night more than I'd like to admit. Each of these stories I've shared tonight carries the same thread: ordinary places made strange. The smallest details turned just enough to leave you unsettled. Whether it was an odd stare, an unfamiliar sound, or a silence that felt inhabited, the terror came not from what we could see, but from what we couldn't explain away. That's the part that lingers long after the night ends. It doesn't matter if it happened in a warehouse, a diner, a roadside motel, or on an empty stretch of highway. What unnerves us most is realizing that the line between safe and unsafe, known and unknown, is thinner than we want to believe. These moments stay with me because they don't demand belief. They exist quietly in memory, small but persistent, like a draft under a closed door. Maybe you've had something similar, something you never told anyone. because it felt too minor to matter, yet it never quite left you. I think that's what binds these accounts together, the reminder that dread doesn't need proof, only presence. Thank you for staying with me until the end of these stories. If you've enjoyed this quiet journey through the strange and uneasy, I hope you'll join me again for more nights like this. Feel free to share your own memory of a place or a moment that unsettled you. Sometimes the smallest details make the most haunting stories. Until then, sleep well and good night.